Close your eyes and picture the world centuries ago tonight. We'll bring those distant moments back to life, offering a soothing retreat from today's bustle. The air is warm but soft, drifting over endless grasslands. There's a faint scent of dust and dried herbs mingling with the distant sound of insect wings. A rising sun spreads gold over the low hills, illuminating stone walls that rise like waves frozen in time. These are not castle battlements or the ruins of a forgotten European monastery. No, these curved enclosures and stacked granite walls belong to Great Zimbabwe, an ancient city built without mortar. And yet it has stood for centuries. You walk slowly, your feet brushing through brittle grasses, your shadow stretching toward a cluster of crumbling towers. The silence is vast but never empty. Birds chatter from the trees. Wind whistles through narrow passageways. Somewhere close, a lizard scrapes its claws against sun-warmed stone. The city looks abandoned, but it was once alive, buzzing with voices, clinking with metalwork, busy with markets and ceremony. Over 18,000 people lived here at its peak. And yet, despite its size and significance, it disappeared from memory for generations, buried not by war but by time and misinterpretation. You'll explore that soon enough. For now, you stand beneath the granite. You tilt your head to admire the great enclosure's elliptical curves. Puzzled, how did they lift these heavy stones without machines? Why are the walls so impossibly neat, and who lived inside them? Spoiler, not you. You probably wouldn't have survived long. Disease, wild animals, political scheming, and the heat. Oh, the heat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget, post your location and local time. I'm always curious where you're listening from. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You follow the path uphill. The stones get bigger the farther you go. Some are the size of dinner plates. Others are massive, almost as tall as you. But there's no mortar between them. The walls are filled with precision, each stone laid carefully on the next. It's called dry stone masonry, and it's surprisingly resilient. These curved barriers once served many purposes. Defense, yes, but also privacy symbolism status. Some led to elite homes. Others encircled ceremonial areas. The great enclosure itself is the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara, and as you meander through its tight corridors, you feel strangely protected and slightly watched. The builders of this city are ancestors of today's Shona people. Their language lives on too. Zimbabwe comes from Zimbadzamabwe, meaning houses of stone, which makes you wonder, if this was the house, what kind of stories did its walls hold? The earliest stones were likely laid in the 11th century, but people lived in this region long before that. Before walls, there were huts. Before trade, there were fire circles and shared stories under starlight. But here's the thing. Historians love to argue about who exactly built what was Great Zimbabwe. The capital of a sprawling empire, or just the showy center of a loose trade network? Did the rulers claim divine descent, or were they just really persuasive cattle hoarders? You walk a little farther, brushing past a stone wall still standing after 800 years. A bird darts overhead, a lilac-breasted roller flashes of turquoise and violet in its wings. These birds were sacred, once possibly linked to the soapstone figures you'll meet later. But tonight, it just perches on a stump and tilts its head at you as if to say, "Keep going, you haven't seen the good bits yet." And so you do. Past carved pathways beneath fig trees that have rooted into the cracks of granite. You pause at a tower that looks too round, too perfect. What was it for storage a lookout a symbol? Nobody knows for sure. Some say it was a granary. Others suggest it was ceremonial, a way to say we're here, we're powerful. Respect the tower. One quirky tidbit: archaeologists found not only iron tools here, but also objects from as far away as Persia and China. And yet the architecture stayed uniquely local. No imported blueprints, no outside stonemasons. Just a knowledge passed down from hands to hands, unrecorded and somehow precise. You start to notice small details, a narrow passage where only one person can walk through at a time. Strategic, possibly, but also deeply symbolic. In many traditional Shona beliefs, tight spaces represent transitions. Maybe this was the entry to sacred ground. Maybe it was a message not all can pass. You sit for a moment, leaning against cool stone. There's no roof now, but you imagine what it must have felt like during a summer storm. Rain pounding on thatch drums, echoing through the valley, smoke from cooking fires rising through the mist. These walls have no inscriptions, no grand mosaics or carved names, but they speak in shape and form. They whisper legacies built not on written records, but on rhythm ritual, and the placement of stones that still refuse to fall. And now the sun rises higher, shadows shrink. You stretch and stand. Ahead, the land flattens into the valley where thousands once bartered, danced, and lived full lives without ever once checking email. A simpler time maybe, but not an easier one. Your journey is just beginning. The bones of a city await its livestock, its markets, its politics, its mysteries. You'll get to all of it. But first, a small warning. You may find yourself strangely soothed by the notion that even massive stone cities crumble gently over time, leaving behind a peaceful hush. And so you follow that hush deeper into the stones. You descend from the great wall's feet, brushing past tufts of wild grass and the occasional termite mound, like miniature castles. The open land below stretches endlessly, dotted with trees and dry scrub. But long before the towers of Great Zimbabwe touched the sky, this was the land of fire circles and hand tools, where lives were shaped not by stone, but by clay bone and the flicker of early evening flames. Thousands of years before any stone was stacked, this region was home to nomadic hunter-gatherers. The Sand People, known for their intricate rock art and whispered tales passed through generations, moved lightly across the land. You picture them under the stars, crouched near the fire, laughing softly as they roasted tubers and told stories of animals with human voices. Maybe you'd be welcome at their fire, or maybe you'd be the subject of one of those stories, the stranger who couldn't start a fire. As the millennia turned, something shifted. Iron Age farmers began to arrive, bringing seeds, pottery, and livestock. These weren't invaders with swords and siege towers. They were families looking for fertile soil, steady rains, and a place to raise goats that wouldn't mysteriously vanish in the night. They built round homes of mud and thatch, organized into circular villages, each one with a grain bin, standing tall in the center like a chieftain's belly. And here's where the sleepy magic begins. These villages weren't just practical, they were symbolic. Round walls reflected the cycle of life. Doors faced east to greet the rising sun. Even cattle pens weren't just pens. They were spiritual spaces often placed at the heart of the settlement, connecting the physical world to the ancestral realm. You squat beside the ghostly outline of one such homestead, imagining the warmth of baked earth beneath your fingertips. Children once played here. Old women brewed sorghum beer and clicked their tongues at wandering chickens. Smoke drifted upward in lazy spirals, carrying with it smells of roasting meat and dried herbs. It might have been simple, but it wasn't crude. These were the earliest architects of southern Africa, not with stone, but with symmetry, rhythm, and memory. It wasn't long before these early agriculturalists realized the value of cattle strongbacks for plowing milk for drinking, and the prestige of owning more than your neighbor. Cattle were wealth, cattle were security, and in a society without banks or Bitcoin, cattle were the original investment portfolio. Need to seal a marriage alliance, 2 cows, and a good attitude. Want respect at the local gathering, show up with a well-fed bull. Historians still argue whether the early settlements like these functioned as proto-cities or simply clusters of kin-based homesteads. Were they laying the groundwork for statehood? Or just doing what humans always do, living together, farming together, and trying not to argue over whose goat chewed the chieftain's reed mat? Either way, these modest clusters gradually expanded. Clay pots grew more elaborate, burial rituals became more intricate, and social structures emerged like termite hills, slowly, invisibly, but powerfully. Here's a quirky detail. Some of the oldest Iron Age ceramics in this region have zigzag designs that may have symbolized water or lightning. Whether they were warnings or wishes, no one knows. But imagine holding a pot designed by someone who saw lightning not just as weather, but as conversation from the ancestors. You brush your fingers against a shard of ancient terracotta half buried in the soil. It's surprisingly smooth. A groove curves across its side as if a long dead hand still lingers in its memory. You place it back gently. Artifacts like these don't belong in pockets. They belong in stories. As agriculture flourished, so did trade, first locally, then regionally. Beads made of ostrich shell passed from hand to hand. Iron blades were forged in clay furnaces, then swapped for millet honey or a neighbor's best chicken. Slowly, networks formed. Not roads exactly, but routes, paths worn by feet, hooves, and wheels of imagination. One day, someone would follow these paths all the way to the coast, meet traders from faraway lands, and return with stories of ships, silk, and spices. But for now, the land remained quiet, peaceful, local. You feel it in the air, a pulse beneath your feet like roots pressing upward to remind you this isn't just a place. It's a becoming. You wander farther, stepping over a ruined cattle pen, and your eye catches something odd. Rows of stones forming a half circle hidden beneath grass. Not as grand as great Zimbabwe's towers, but still intentional. This might have been a communal meeting space, or a grave site, or a stage for courtship rituals where young men tried not to embarrass themselves dancing in front of their crushes. Another quirky tidbit. Some archaeological evidence suggests that early communities here may have used powdered termite mound material in construction. Yes, bug dirt to strengthen their walls. Termite engineers nature's original architects. The sun is dipping now, casting long shadows that stretch like arms across the earth. You pause beside a tall termite mound, almost as if paying your respects. These humble beginnings of clay, of cattle, of cooperation, laid the groundwork for what would one day become stone cities, complex economies, and royal dynasties. But there's something comforting here. Before kings and conquests, before gold dust and foreign envoys, there were quiet evenings like this one. Huts glowing with firelight, pots simmering with stew, children asleep under grass roofs while the wind carried the distant hoot of an owl. You sigh and sit down in the cooling grass. The stars are beginning to prick the sky. You're no longer standing at the foot of ruins, you're wrapped in the memory of a world just beginning to dream of itself. And somewhere out there, someone is striking iron with stone, making the first blade that will someday shape a kingdom. You wake slowly, not from sleep, but from the deep hush that settles between memories and ruins. The wind rustles tall grass beside you. The stars have dimmed and dawn glows faintly on the horizon, its light creeping back over the hills like a whisper. As you stretch your limbs and stand, you're drawn forward again into the folds of history, this time toward a word, a name, an idea that grew into an identity: Zimbabwe. Not the modern nation, not yet, but the word. Zimbabwe houses of stone. The language is Shona still spoken today, and it reaches backward through centuries, its syllables rooted in the soil like the trees that outlast seasons. You pronounce it softly, Zimbabwe. The consonants roll gently on your tongue, and the meaning settles like a stone in your palm. Great Zimbabwe wasn't just the name of one place. It became a symbol of greatness, of pride, of mystery. But its meaning began humbly as a descriptor. This place, this home is made of stone. There are no grand plaques explaining the etymology. No dusty Latin roots or Greek mythology here. Just lived experience. People looked at these buildings and named them accordingly. Practical, poetic, and oddly powerful. You walk along the outer curves of one such house of stone. It bends inward as it rises, like it's hugging itself against time. The granite blocks are weathered smooth. There's no mortar, and yet the wall stands firm, elegant in its defiance of gravity. A sentence carved without letters. The word Zimbabwe likely spread as travelers carried tales from this stone metropolis to other parts of the region. Some scholars believe the term was first used only for royal enclosures. Others argue it simply meant great house. The debate continues: was the name exclusive, reserved for kings? Or was it more universal, applied to any walled homestead with enough flair? Historians still argue whether the term evolved as a political label or a spiritual one. Was it about sovereignty or sacredness? You pause at a narrow passage where the stones curve tightly, forcing you to walk in single file. It feels deliberate. Maybe it was. These spaces were meant to impress and control. A visitor arriving at Great Zimbabwe would have walked through these winding corridors flanked by tall granite, the walls so close they'd brush both shoulders. There's power in that sensation. You're not just entering a settlement. You're being led into something older and deeper. You think again about language, how words shape identity. A curious fact: the earliest mention of Zimbabwe in written European records comes from Portuguese traders in the 16th century. But they didn't quite get it right. The spelling shifted. The pronunciation tangled. For a while, the word drifted through the annals of colonialism like a ghost in a broken mirror, reflecting some truth, but never clearly. And yet among the Shona it stayed, quiet, steady, enduring. Names matter, especially when others try to rename you. Another quirky tidbit: some early colonial accounts referred to Great Zimbabwe as the palace of the Queen of Sheba, assuming such grandeur couldn't possibly be indigenous. Europeans were baffled. These ruins didn't fit their preconceived map of African history, so they reached for myths. Solomon, Sheba, Phoenicians, aliens. Well, maybe not aliens yet, but you could feel it coming. You sit now at the base of a rounded tower inside the great enclosure. The air is warm, still faintly sweet with the scent of crushed wild basil. You think about the power of names, how they can erase or resurrect. For years, Great Zimbabwe was hidden under other titles. The ruins. Those strange walls that place the locals talk about. Only later, long after the stones had quieted, was the original name reclaimed. Reclaimed with pride, with defiance, with a whisper that said this was ours all along, and not just the stones. The culture, too. Shona's spiritual life infused every structure, every passage, every space. Even the layout of homes and enclosures echoed the spiritual world, concentric, layered, spiraling inward. Each circle led closer to the sacred. You wonder if walking through Great Zimbabwe was like walking through a prayer. Here's something else. The soapstone birds icons found at the site are believed to have been totems of clan lineages. These weren't decorative lawn ornaments. They were declarations, warnings, blessings. Their presence speaks of a culture where words and symbols carried weight even when unspoken. You pass one now, or rather its replica. The real ones were removed displayed, hoarded fought over. But the shape is still striking: the outstretched wings, the curved beak, the sense that it's both watching and remembering. You ask yourself quietly, if a city could name itself, what would it say? Perhaps it already has. Zimbabwe. You whisper it again. Not just a word, but a legacy. Later in the modern era, the word would be chosen deliberately by independence leaders seeking to break from the colonial name of Rhodesia. Not because it sounded nice, not because it was convenient, but because it meant something ancient and powerful and local. To say Zimbabwe was to reclaim the voice of 1,000 ancestors. And now you return to your walk, stepping carefully over small stones, ducking under a fallen branch. You begin to notice other names too. Place names rooted in Shona Ndebele Venda, each one like a breadcrumb in the dust trail of heritage. Names carry stories. They carry losses too. But here in the stone labyrinth of a forgotten empire, they also carry rest. The sun climbs higher now, filtering through the sparse canopy. A group of vervet monkeys chitter in a tree ahead. They don't seem impressed by the ruins, but they've probably lived here longer than any tour guide. You pass one final inscription, not carved in stone, but etched in lichen and shadow. Just shapes, curves, silhouettes. But if you listen closely, they say what the walls have whispered all along. This place was known, this place had a name, and that name still echoes even now in the hush between your footsteps. The morning air turns warmer as you descend into the valley again. The ground crunches faintly beneath your steps. Dried leaves, tiny stones, ancient dust. A few goats bleat distantly, the sound drifting through the brush like a memory you can't quite place. And you begin to realize something in this part of the world. History wasn't carved in marble or chiseled into columns. It walked on four legs and mooed. Cattle, more than anything else, built the foundations of great Zimbabwe's wealth, status, and power. Not gold, not conquest, just a whole lot of well-fed cows. You trudge slowly past the outline of an ancient kraal and enclosure for livestock. The walls have crumbled, but the soil tells the story. Rich, dark, layered with centuries of manure and ash. Archaeologists love this stuff. They sift through it like it's buried treasure. Because, in a way, it is. To own cattle here was to hold power. Herds were not just wealth. They were political leverage, social security, and romantic currency. If you didn't have at least a few cows, forget trying to get married. You'd be about as appealing as a goat with a limp. The Shona people and other Bantu-speaking communities in the region organized their society around livestock. A man's herds defined his worth and his legacy. Dowries were negotiated with cows. Disputes were settled with cows. Religious offerings, cows again. You're starting to see the pattern. But it wasn't all just economic. There's something almost spiritual in the way cattle were woven into daily life. They weren't just animals, they were lineage. You might even know each one by name: Guru, the stubborn one; Dema, the one with the lazy eye; Chetsa, the prized beauty. And yes, it was completely normal to whisper secrets to your cows. They listened better than humans. As Great Zimbabwe rose in complexity, cattle ownership stratified. Elites amassed huge herds, sometimes cared for by retainers or clients, who hoped to curry favor or curry goat depending on the season. Grazing land became a political asset. If your kraal was full, your word carried more weight. If your grazing rights were revoked, well, good luck. You come across a narrow stone corridor that leads to an open courtyard, once part of a private residence. It's here historians believe that high-ranking individuals stored not only grain, but cattle-related wealth horns, hides, milk jars. There's even evidence of specialized structures for dairy production, which means, yes, ancient butter was a thing. Somewhere, someone churned with great determination while humming tunes that no one remembers now. And here's a quirky little fact. The bones of sacrificed cattle found at Great Zimbabwe suggest that meat eating wasn't everyday fare. Beef was reserved for the elite or for rituals. Regular folks, they stuck to grains, greens, and the occasional chicken if it wandered too far from its flock. So in many ways, cows weren't meant to be eaten. They were meant to be seen, admired, counted. You wander now through a grassy field where the bones of a long-lost kraal lie buried beneath your feet. The heat is rising. Cicadas buzz in the distance. You sip water and imagine the sound of thousands of hooves stamping the earth at dusk dust curling around the horizon. Cowbells clinking in rhythmic pulses. If you were here centuries ago, you'd know how to read the herd, who was healthy, who was nervous, who was in the mood to wander. But with wealth comes division. Society began to split those with cattle and those without, those with land and those who herded it. Power consolidated around livestock, and from that grew hierarchy protocol law. You could almost say that before Zimbabwe had kings, it had cow kings. Historians still argue whether this cattle-based system functioned more as a kingdom or a confederation of chiefdoms. Was it centrally governed or loosely held together by shared beliefs and economic exchange? What's certain is this: wherever cattle congregated, influence followed. You make your way now toward a narrow stream water gurgling gently over smooth stones. It's small, barely more than a trickle in the dry season, but it mattered. Cattle need water, and where water flowed, settlements formed. That's one reason Great Zimbabwe grew where it did. Not only were there granite boulders for building, but pastures for grazing and water for livestock. Location, location, location. Here's another odd tidbit: some kraals were believed to be protected by ancestral spirits. People would leave offerings, beer snuff, even carved wooden animals to ensure the herd stayed healthy. A sick cow wasn't just an economic loss. It could signal spiritual imbalance. An unhappy ancestor, a neglected promise. You cross the stream on a natural stone bridge and look back. The landscape rolls softly here, open and quiet. You think about the invisible map beneath your feet, the grazing routes, the footpath to watering holes, the shaded spots where herders napped beneath trees and carved symbols into bark. You can almost hear them now, young boys whistling to keep the cattle moving, dogs barking around the stragglers, elders sitting nearby discussing weather patterns and trade rumors. News traveled through these hills on hoof and breath. And speaking of trade, that's coming next. Because once your cattle gave you status, you needed something to spend it on. You needed beads, cloth, copper, maybe a really nice pipe, or a handful of glass imported from lands you'd never see. Cows bought more than wives and land; they bought the world. You pat a nearby rock as if thanking it for the stories. It's warm to the touch, sun-baked and solid, like the people who once built lives here quietly, steadily, brick by careful brick and cow by careful cow. And so you continue, the sun now climbing higher, casting long shadows of your figure across a pasture that has long since gone to seed. Behind you, a goat bleats lazily. In front of you, the ghost of a market awaits its stalls, its clamor, its wild tangle of commerce. But before you go, spare a moment for the cows, because without them, none of this would have stood. You leave the valley behind and follow a trail that snakes upward again, gentle at first, then steeper, flanked by boulders, stacked as if by ancient hands. The path tightens. Your steps echo softly in the silence and the walls begin to rise once more. You've reached the iconic heartbeat of Great Zimbabwe, the great enclosure, and no mortar holds it together. The stones are perfectly balanced. They curve, they climb, they wrap around the hill like an arm around a sleeping child. It's silent now, but you feel it. Power, intention. Some say the structure hums in the heat, like the stone remembers too much to stay still. You're inside what may have been the largest ancient stone structure in sub-Saharan Africa. And no one can agree exactly what it was for. Historians still argue whether it was a royal palace, a ritual center, a symbol of fertility, or something else entirely. There's no throne room, no sacrificial altar, no helpful interpretive signage chiseled into the granite, just walls some 10 meters high up to 5 meters thick, and a conical tower that serves no obvious structural function. It simply exists. You run your hand across a surface of one block. It's smooth like a loaf of bread that forgot to rise. There are no carvings, no glue, no ancient secret mortar recipe passed down from Egyptian masons. This is dry stone construction at its finest. Each piece placed by hand relying on shape, weight, and friction to hold everything together. It's like building a jigsaw puzzle made of boulders, then daring gravity to ruin it. Here's the kicker: the walls curve, but they don't wobble. No right angles, just endless gentle bends. And the stones, mostly granite, were quarried nearby. Workers would use fire to heat the rock, then splash it with cold water to cause it to crack. Over time, they shaped each block with hammers and chisels, hauling them to the site, stacking them like a meditation. 1,000 years later, they're still standing. Some of the joints are so precise it's hard to slip a coin between them. You consider testing this with a coin from your pocket, but then realize you're wearing pajama pants, and ancient architects didn't design their legacy to compete with sweatpants and loose change. The great enclosure may have served as a royal residence or ceremonial space, depending on which archaeologist you ask. Inside, remnants of clay huts have been found suggesting people lived here. But who royal wives, priests, astrologers with impressive star charts and even more impressive gossip? You pass the famous conical tower, now smooth-sided, unadorned, mysterious, shaped like a giant upside-down funnel. At nearly 10 meters high, it has no entrance. It's not hollow. It holds nothing inside. And that has driven centuries of speculation. Some suggest it symbolized masculinity paired with the enclosing curved walls as a metaphor for fertility. Others think it was simply a display of wealth and craftsmanship. Still others believe it functioned like a granary, symbolic or otherwise. But no one really knows. It just stands there confidently confusing everyone. Quirky detail: the great enclosure contains no defensive features, no battlements, no guard towers, no arrow slits. If this was a fortress, it was a very polite one, which suggests its purpose wasn't war, but power, the visual kind. Architecture is theater. You walk the inner path now, where narrow passageways twist between the inner and outer walls. One section is especially tight. You press sideways to slip through. The stones feel close on your arms, not threatening, just intentional. As if you're being funneled, focused, prepared. Like the walls are asking, are you ready to enter sacred space? You step into a courtyard. The sun warms your back. Once this area may have held ceremony, conversation, and perhaps confrontation. The soil is packed flat by centuries of forgotten feet. You look around. The walls curve away on all sides. And you feel enclosed, yes, but also cradled. This is not a place meant to intimidate. It's meant to impress. Another quirky tidbit: archaeologists have found exotic items here: glass beads, Persian bowls, even Chinese porcelain. This was not a hidden kingdom. It was plugged into trade networks that stretched across the Indian Ocean. And all that wealth may have been stored or displayed right here. You look up again at the walls. In some areas, decorative friezes made from triangular patterns are still visible, small zigzags and chevrons near the top. No one really knows what they mean, but they're deliberate. And they remind you that architecture can be language, even when the dictionary is lost. Down below, far past the hills, the valley sprawls wide. The common people would have lived there in huts clustered together, cooking, crafting, raising children, herding livestock. The great enclosure rises above it all, not just physically, symbolically. Power lived up here. Status was measured in altitude and stonework, and yet, unlike many ancient cities, there are no statues of kings, no giant reliefs declaring the glory of this or that ruler. No, I came, I saw, I conquered chisels. It's as if the builders didn't need to shout. They just stacked stones higher than anyone else. You sit on a ledge now, a smooth granite block warmed by the sun. The cicadas drone softly. A breeze moves through the corridor behind you, carrying the scent of dry earth and crushed leaves. You feel still, small, connected. Somewhere deep in the enclosure past collapsed walls and hidden alcoves lies a sense of sacred geometry. Circles within circles, curves upon curves. This wasn't just shelter, it was cosmology. You take one last look around before standing. The conical tower watches silently. The walls curve on, disappearing into shadow. The wind tugs at your sleeve, urging you onward. You leave without answers, but that's all right. Some monuments aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be walked through slowly, like a prayer or a dream. You step softly now, deeper into the maze of stone and memory. The sun has begun its slow arc toward the afternoon, casting longer shadows across the courtyards of Great Zimbabwe. You find yourself drawn towards something quieter than walls, more intimate than towers, symbols carved not in script but in shape, in smooth curves and sacred birds. Soapstone. It's soft as stone, goes easy to carve, yet sturdy enough to last centuries. And hidden within the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, carefully buried in platforms and passageways, were 8 mysterious artifacts, the soapstone birds. Each one stands about 40 centimeters tall, perched atop a pedestal, stylized but not abstract. Broad curved beaks, wide watchful eyes, tucked wings. Not hawks or owls or eagles, exactly, something older, stranger, more spiritual. They weren't just decorative. These birds weren't lawn ornaments. They were totems, powerful symbols likely tied to clan identity, ritual authority, and ancestral presence. They may have represented messengers between the living and the dead. Watchers, witnesses, warnings. You pass a replica now placed on a boulder for visitors. Its eyes are deep and still. It stares through you, not at you. You feel like a guest in someone else's sanctuary. Historians still argue whether these birds depicted specific clans. Some suggest they may represent the Hungwe, the fish eagle clan, who claimed deep spiritual and political significance. Others think the birds symbolized kingship itself, like spiritual sentinels of the royal line. But the original birds weren't found perched atop towers or displayed in shrines. They were buried carefully hidden inside walls and behind platforms, as if too sacred for sunlight. Their presence feels intentional, secretive, and heavy with meaning. You reach one such platform now. A low rise in the middle of the hill complex where stones form a rough square around a center of packed earth. Here offerings might have been made. Beer poured to ancestors. bones buried beneath the surface. Even today, local spirit mediums say the hill remains alive with power, and they tread with quiet reverence. Another quirky detail: several soapstone items at the site were shaped not as birds but as bowls, hollow smooth and often deliberately broken before burial. Rituals of breaking are common in spiritual traditions, shattering vessels to release energy to mark the end of a rite or to ensure the object could not be misused. You pause beside a small cluster of granite blocks half buried in earth. A faint breeze stirs. You get the sense that these weren't just architectural remnants. They were altars, perhaps shrines, or stage sets for ceremonies involving mediums, music, smoke, and silence. Sacred space at Great Zimbabwe wasn't about glittering gold or towering idols. It was quiet, layered, and local. Belief wasn't imposed from above, it welled up from within. From the land, the stones, the ancestors beneath your feet, and the layout of the city mirrors this. The hill complex perched atop the granite outcrop likely served as a ceremonial center, not just because of its elevation, but because of its proximity to the sky to spirit. Down in the valley, the great enclosure dazzled with its engineering, but here on the hill, things feel older, rougher, and more sacred. From your perch, you can see everything: the valley below, the soft sweep of hills, the gentle sprawl of woodland. It's easy to imagine a priest or rainmaker standing here calling on the ancestors, watching the horizon for signs. A whirlwind, a bird in flight, the first roll of thunder. Here's a fringe theory: some scholars suggest that soapstone birds weren't just clan markers, they were used in divination, carried by spirit mediums, hidden during times of conflict, retrieved when balance needed to be restored. It's speculation, but it fits the mood here. There's something in the air, something that makes you want to tread more quietly, speak more softly, listen a little harder. You follow a path to another platform, and there, partly covered by fallen leaves, you see it a small soapstone fragment shaped like a wing. Not real, of course, but your mind fills in the gaps. You imagine it whole, perched atop its pedestal, watching as kings were crowned, babies were named, rains were prayed for. In Shona tradition, birds are messengers between worlds. They travel from earth to sky, bridging the seen and unseen. The soapstone birds may not have been worshipped, but they were respected, feared even. And when colonial agents stumbled upon them centuries later, they didn't understand. So they took them. Most of the original soapstone birds were removed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, shipped to museums in Europe and South Africa. Only some have returned. One now appears on Zimbabwe's national flag. Others sit in glass cases stared at by people who may never understand what it means to be watched by stone. And yet the spirit lingers. You descend from the platform, the afternoon light dappling the path. The birds, the shrines, the sacred space, all of it clings to the place like mist. You can't see it, but you feel it. It's the kind of feeling you get walking into an old church or standing before a tree older than memory. A hush, a holding, a sense that your presence is being noted. You walk a little farther now, tracing the outer edge of the hill complex. You pause beside a half-collapsed hut foundation. Once this may have been a priest's dwelling, or a royal concubine's, or a spirit medium's retreat. Another quirky footnote: some soapstone carvings feature strange patterns, interlocking lines and dots that don't resemble any known script. Were they decorative ritual? A lost language? No one knows. But it's tempting to imagine that these stones too once spoke, and now the sun slips low. The shadows lengthen. The wind picks up slightly, stirring your clothes in the tall grass nearby. A bird calls out in the distance, sharp, sudden, fading. You think again of those stone eyes, watchful, patient, unblinking. You don't have to believe in spirits to feel the gravity of this place. Some knowledge lives outside language. Some truths refuse to be excavated. So you leave them be. You follow the trail downward back toward the valley. The path is familiar now, but something has changed. You are being watched, but not with judgment, with memory. You emerge from the sacred hush of the hill complex and step onto a wide, sunlit plain. The silence fades here, replaced by movement echo exchange. This was no place for priests or soapstone birds. This was where the business happened. You're standing now in what was once the commercial heart of Great Zimbabwe. A hub of trade so surprisingly connected it makes your modern delivery app look sluggish. The valley around you may seem quiet now, but centuries ago it pulsed with the rhythm of exchange beads clinking in pouches, goats bleating in the background, conversations layered in at least 4 languages. It's not that different from a chaotic market day anywhere today, except here you might be bartering for something that had crossed half the globe to get to you. Because here's the wild part among the ruins of Great Zimbabwe. Archaeologists found imported glass beads from India, Persian glazed ceramics, and Chinese porcelain, all dated to between the 11th and 15th centuries. Pause and think about that. Before Europe had even figured out how to draw a halfway decent map of Africa, caravans of goods were making their way inland through the Swahili coast, Kilwa, Sofala, Mombasa, trading with inland empires like Great Zimbabwe in exchange for ivory gold, and possibly a really cool locally brewed millet beer. You kneel beside a stretch of compacted soil once the floor of a bustling dwelling or merchant stall. Tiny fragments of pottery still peek out from the earth. Red burnished clay with faint ridges. You imagine hands passing a bowl, laughter in Shona or Arabic, a rough chuckle as a deal is sealed with a nod and the toss of a bead string. Beads were everywhere. Glass ones, usually blue or green, were especially prized. They weren't made here, but they became currency here. A child might wear a string as a necklace. A merchant might offer them in bundles tied with leather. The right color or shape could seal an agreement or start a feud. Another curious tidbit. Some beads found in Great Zimbabwe were traced to places as far as present-day Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Which means in a sleepy, landlocked city of stone and cattle, someone once held a piece of the Indian Ocean world in their hand. But trade wasn't just exotic luxuries and shiny things. It was also deeply local. Iron tools were forged here and traded with neighboring villages. Textiles likely made from bark or cotton were dyed with local plants. Salt was harvested fish-dried, and yes, there was beer. Sorghum beer, thick, earthy, fermented in large clay pots and consumed at nearly every important event. Weddings, harvest festivals, negotiations, Tuesdays. You glance toward the low hill on the horizon. That's where the gold was mined from veins in the earth, panned from riverbeds extracted with iron tools and patience. Gold wasn't just an export item. It was the beating heart of Great Zimbabwe's power. It gave the kingdom leverage and invitation to global networks and perhaps the ability to pay off someone who was being a bit too nosy about your cattle count. Historians still argue whether Great Zimbabwe was the central authority controlling gold trade directly, or whether it merely facilitated the flow between miners and coastal merchants. Was this an empire with a centralized tax system, or a loose confederation with really efficient marketplaces? Either way, the goods flowed, gold moved out. Beads, ceramics, cloth, and ideas flowed in, and with them came people. Swahili-speaking merchants, Arab traders, maybe even the occasional rogue sailor who got very, very lost. They may not have stayed long, just long enough to rest to trade to spread a rumor or two. But they left traces behind. A ceramic sherd here, a design copied into a pot there, a new word borrowed and blended into local dialects. One fringe theory. Some archaeologists believe that a merchant quarter once stood just beyond the main enclosures built with perishable materials like wood and thatch. No stone, no permanence. Just woven structures bustling with deals, gossip, and enough goat thefts to fuel 5 soap operas. You step into what remains of one such domestic area now. Foundations of huts appear as low stone circles, most barely knee-high. They may have held granaries, kitchens, sleeping quarters, or temporary lodging for foreign guests. It's possible if you squint hard enough and let your imagination drift to picture lanterns swaying fires, crackling a weary traveler pouring tea from a worn metal pot. A goat trots past. You wonder if it's a descendant of a goat that wandered through this very same spot 600 years ago. Probably not, but maybe. Here's a slightly embarrassing colonial-era anecdote. When European explorers and archaeologists began investigating the site, some refused to believe that Africans could have orchestrated this level of trade. So they proposed wild theories, Phoenicians, Arabs, even wandering Hebrews, because heaven forbid local people be economically sophisticated. The truth, as always, is more mundane and more powerful. African societies built this. They ran it. They thrived. And when the Portuguese finally arrived on the southeastern coast of Africa in the 1500s, they heard whispers of a rich inland kingdom of stone. They called it Zimbabwe, a mangled echo of Zimbabwe. They never found the gold mines. But they knew somehow that a place of power had once stood behind the horizon. You sit down on a shaded rock and watch the wind stir the dry grass. The trade winds that once carried dhows across the Indian Ocean have stilled here. But the traces remain, in pottery, in stories, in the slow drift of a blue glass bead buried beneath the earth waiting to be found. Trade was never just about things. It was about connection. And Great Zimbabwe, nestled in its granite hills, was more connected than anyone ever gave it credit for. You rise brushing dust from your hands and glance west. The sun is beginning to tilt downward now. Time to move again. Ahead lies a slope, one that leads to royal chambers and political intrigue. But the path you've taken so far, it's paved in beadwork breath and the quiet footprints of those who bartered under a stone sky. You follow the sloping trail now from the valley of traders and bead sellers toward the rising ground where power once perched. The walls reappear not as vast or sweeping as the great enclosure, but arranged in quiet layers spiraling around clusters of domestic space. It's here that status truly became stone. The city of Great Zimbabwe wasn't planned like a grid or a Roman camp. It grew organically, stone clusters forming like mushrooms around clearings, weaving private lives with public symbolism. But there was a pattern if you knew where to look. Elites lived up the slope. The poor lived in the flats. And in between them, ritual, reputation, and a lot of gossip. You pass another hut foundation, now modest but larger than most. It likely belonged to someone important, though not the king himself. Maybe a trusted advisor. Maybe a high-ranking merchant with diplomatic flair and an unnervingly well-fed goat. The walls are gone, but the layout remains. Courtyard here, granary platform there, a possible space for brewing beer because, of course, this was a society deeply conscious of space. Where you lived mattered. Who could see into your courtyard or couldn't mattered. Access was everything. In the upper zones, families built their homes within circular stone enclosures. These weren't just protective. They were statements. Enclosure meant prestige. To be inside the ring was to be within the favored class. Below in the open spaces, the less privileged built in clusters homes, separated by reed fences instead of stone. The Shona have a concept called dare, a space for counsel, for discussion, for justice. These appeared in elite areas, flat central clearings where disputes were settled, alliances forged, and decisions whispered between mouthfuls of roasted maize. One quirky detail: some stone clusters were designed with intentionally narrow passageways, not only for symbolic reasons, but also to force visitors to approach slowly bowed, slightly unable to run or hide. Imagine a visitor trundling through a tight corridor, heart thudding, wondering if the chief was in a generous mood that day. You round a bend in the trail and reach a small platform with scattered pottery sherds, many likely used in domestic rituals. Here, cooking and prayer often went hand in hand. Clay pots held not just stew but significance. Some were used only once, filled with offerings broken after use fragments left as tribute. Historians still argue whether the elite residences were occupied year-round or seasonally. Did the rulers reside here always, or did they migrate with herds returning for ceremonies? Either way, these elevated homes offered more than privacy. They offered perspective. From here you look down over the valley, the markets, the trade paths, the ripple of homes across the grass. You imagine a ruler standing where you stand now, arms crossed, eyes scanning the plains like a cat, surveying a room full of unaware mice. Power moved through sightlines. If you could see others, you could judge them. If they couldn't see you, you could watch in peace. It's not so different from how some people angle their webcams, just so commanding the frame, hiding the laundry behind them. You continue onward, passing another courtyard, this one slightly more elaborate. Double walls, a higher platform. Here perhaps lived a woman of rank, a wife of the king, or a spiritual figure with influence. Shona society was not rigidly patriarchal. Women held property, ran households, and occasionally mediated disputes. Power in this world wasn't just muscle, it was measured in cattle story and the favor of the ancestors. And the ancestors, as always, were close. Many homes featured shallow altars or offering platforms of raised stone with a small dish or bowl where food, beer, or snuff might be placed. A gift for the departed, a plea, a thank you, or maybe just a quiet daily habit like someone lighting a candle on a windowsill. Another curious tidbit: some elite enclosures have carved stone lips at their entrances, raised thresholds meant to demarcate sacred space. Cross this, they say, and act accordingly. No lying, no violence, and probably no interrupting someone's beer mid-sip. You reach a shadowed alcove now overgrown, a little crumbled. But something about it feels poised, as if waiting. This might have been a gathering space, or a ritual site, or a really good spot for dramatic declarations like, "You dare challenge the king." It's quiet now. Birds chatter in a nearby tree. A pair of vervet monkeys tumble in the underbrush, chasing each other with the unself-conscious energy of beings who've never worried about taxes. You sit on a stone ledge, letting your shoulders relax. The breeze rises, and you start to think about how this city was never still. Not really. Even at its quietest, people moved through it, shifting water from wells, sweeping courtyards, telling stories, punishing betrayal, praising the rain. And in the center of all that movement was status. Not just wealth, but proximity to power, to ritual, to the hill, to the right side of the wall. That's the thing about ancient cities, they speak more through layout than legend. And Great Zimbabwe, it murmurs hierarchy through its stones. You descend now toward the mid-level terraces, neither high nor low, a place of ambition. Here, younger leaders might have lived. Children of the ruling class, not yet elevated, but not fully ordinary either. Their homes were simpler, but their futures, perhaps brighter. This was the space of potential. of political maneuvering, of whispered plans by firelight. You pass the remnants of a doorway, a small arch of stacked granite, just barely holding. You step through respectful, and in that moment you feel it again, that ancient gaze, watching, measuring, waiting. You're not being judged, not quite, but you are being remembered. You descend again from stone thresholds and monkey-shadowed courtyards toward the plains where everyday life once unfolded like cloth on a market table. Down here the city stretched wide. No towers, no walls, just clusters of huts and activity, winding paths in the grass and the constant motion of feet, hooves, and voices. This was the city proper, the residential sprawl of Great Zimbabwe. Most people didn't live behind stone. They lived within patterns of thatch clay and cattle. Their homes were circular, built from wooden poles plastered with mud and topped with tightly packed grass roofs that sloped like gentle bells. A neat ring of stones might mark a doorstep or a low platform where elders sat to talk politics, gossip, and grain prices. You pause at one of these remains, now just a faint ring in the dirt, but once it was someone's whole world. A child may have learned to walk here. A grandmother may have ground millet at this very spot. You can almost hear the rhythm scrape, scrape, scrape the pestle against the grinding stone, punctuated by the lazy bleat of a goat who absolutely should not be inside the kitchen. These huts didn't stand alone. They clustered around shared courtyards, usually centered on a granary, a tall, silo-shaped structure raised on stones to keep out rodents. Think of it like a neighborhood pantry, only with slightly more danger from falling over during storms. The Shona people designed these living spaces with intention. Huts faced inward toward each other. The community was circular both literally and socially. Privacy existed, but so did constant proximity. You saw your neighbors. You heard their laughter. You probably smelled their lunch. Another quirky detail, floors were polished smooth with cow dung. Before you recoil, know this, it worked. The mixture hardened to a slick, hygienic surface with a faint, earthy smell. Visitors often complimented the shine. Somewhere there was probably a very proud floor polisher in every household. As you move through this imaginary neighborhood, the sun overhead feels warm but forgiving. You can see why people lived here. The granite hills provided shelter. The soil, though sandy, could support millet, sorghum, and groundnuts. Streams offered water, and those ever-present cattle grazed nearby, lowing gently like walking bank accounts. But life wasn't just survival, it was ceremony, it was rhythm. People didn't merely exist here, they danced. They brewed, they argued, they loved. You passed the remains of a hearth, a blackened circle of stone. Fires weren't just for food, they were the heart of the home. People gathered there to tell stories, to sing songs, to teach children about the ancestors, the rain, and why you shouldn't chase the chickens. Historians still argue whether Great Zimbabwe operated under a centralized monarchy or a federation of elite lineages. Was there one king at the top or several powerful families negotiating alliances like a slow-motion chess match? What we do know is that these lower areas pulsed with activity, and that local leaders likely played key roles in managing their micro-worlds, reporting upward, and enforcing decisions made far above. You step into another ring of stone, this one wider with a few standing stubs of what might have been posts. Maybe it was a gathering place, or a birthing hut, or the space where someone once sat for hours pounding grain and dreaming of better tools. Here's something unexpected: archaeologists have uncovered toys in these areas. Clay figurines of animals, carved game boards, miniature pots. Which means, of course, that kids were kids. They played. They mocked their parents. They made mud oxen and staged little market scenes under the watch of bored dogs. And the ordinariness of it is what makes it feel so vivid. You don't need royalty to understand civilization. You need neighbors. You need someone to borrow fire from. You need a shout across the courtyard. Your goat is in my garden again. Another delightful footnote: musical instruments were found too. Bone whistles, drums, possibly rattles. Music wasn't just background noise. It was a medium of memory, of ritual, of joy. You imagine someone at sunset sitting on a low stool tapping a drum while the day cooled and smoke curled lazily upward from the cook fires. You sit now on a warm rock just on the edge of one of these old neighborhoods. The pattern of life lies quiet, but it's still there in the placement of stones. The blackened earth, the soft rise where a granary once stood. To modern eyes, it might look like nothing. But to trained ones and to you now, it's a city. One built not just on stone, but on repetition. Routine. Rice porridge in the morning. Gossip at noon. Drumming after dark. A fringe theory among scholars. Some believe these open areas hosted informal performances. Storytellers or traveling musicians stopping for a few nights, trading entertainment for food or lodging. These weren't grand theaters, but under the stars with a good tale and a bowl of fermented sorghum who needed grandeur. You glance again toward the upper hill. The stone towers shimmer faintly in the distance, half obscured by heat haze. Up there were politics and prayers. Down here, community, the hum of life. Not all cities are built from monuments. Some are built from patterns, from well-worn paths, from the sound of a child laughing at a chicken who just stole a cassava cake. And now you rise. The sun is lowering, stretching long fingers across the grass. The shadows of invisible huts dance beneath your feet. You imagine stepping through someone's bedroom. You mutter an apology. The wind forgives you. Far ahead, a path begins to slope again toward the courts and compounds of gold and diplomacy. But for now, you linger a moment longer and listen to the ordinary ghosts. The path winds upward once more, cutting through low scrub and whispering grass, the slope gentle but steady. You've left behind the hum of domestic life, the polished dung floors, the clatter of clay bowls, the soft giggles of children, and now you walk toward the places where power was spoken aloud. Where gold glittered, goats were weighed in deals, and diplomacy played out beneath the acacia's shade. This is the realm of the courts. And oh, what a strange and subtle court it must have been. Forget gilded thrones and trumpet fanfare. Here, power didn't wear a crown. It wore a beaded necklace, a perfect posture, and the confidence to speak last in the meeting. The ruler of Great Zimbabwe, possibly known as the Mambo, held sway over territory that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. But the real work happened in small enclosures like this one: neat wall stone benches, places to sit, to argue, to settle things quietly. Or not so quietly. You step into a wide clearing now framed by stone. The walls are lower here, not meant for awe, but for focus. This could have been a council court. Local leaders gathering to speak on taxes, marriage disputes, drought omens, or who exactly let the goats trample the sacred bean patch again. A short platform rises to one side, possibly the seat of the presiding elder. You imagine him now, broad shoulders, quiet eyes, maybe chewing a twig thoughtfully as voices rise and fall around him. Power in this world wasn't about volume, it was about resonance. And at the center of it all, gold. You know the myths. Riches beyond imagination. Kingdoms paved in gold. But here's the truth, much of that gold was dust. Tiny flakes panned from rivers, chipped from veins in the rock. Carefully collected, carefully hidden, and carefully brought here to be weighed, bartered, or offered. Historians still argue whether the gold mines were owned outright by the elite or taxed through a complex network of intermediaries. Either way, the flow of gold was constant. Not coins, not bars, dust, nuggets, powder stored in cloth pouches and offered in cupped hands. You can almost see it sparkling faintly in the sun, glinting in the cracks of someone's palm. Another quirky tidbit. The Shona word for gold is endorama, and it shows up in oral histories linked with diplomacy. He came with endorama, someone might say, meaning the visitor arrived not just with wealth, but with intent. Gold wasn't just currency, it was language. And goats, let's not forget the goats. Cattle might have been the showy wealth, but goats were the practical ones. More portable, less picky about grass, more likely to be traded in daily transactions. A dowry might involve cows, yes, but also a cluster of particularly sassy goats, and a few hens just to sweeten the deal. You imagine now a marriage negotiation taking place on this very ground. Two families gathered, young lovers trying not to make eye contact, elders muttering about bloodlines and rain seasons, beer is passed, jokes are made, and somewhere in the mix a goat is nudged forward like a living signature. Diplomacy in Great Zimbabwe wasn't a foreign thing. It was internal too. Clans and lineages balancing power, forging ties, breaking them, rebuilding them again. Every grain of millet shared, every calabash of beer passed across a fire carried weight. Respect was earned through generosity, strategic alliances, and well-timed silence. You pass a circular enclosure, now perhaps once the home of a noble family. Not royal, but adjacent. Trusted. The walls are higher, the layout more complex. Here, perhaps someone once hosted envoys from another region. They would have arrived with fanfare, drums, dancers, maybe even a leopard skin or two, bearing gifts, salt, copper, exotic beads. Expecting in return hospitality, conversation, and a little bit of gold. And let's not ignore the elephant in the metaphorical room, an actual elephant. Ivory was a major trade item here. Collected from the surrounding regions, sometimes hunted, sometimes scavenged. And if your court had access to ivory, you had leverage. One fringe theory. Some scholars suggest that diplomatic items like tusks, beads, and gold were ritually cleansed before being accepted, washed in sacred water, or laid before ancestors, which, if true, adds a whole extra step to your average meeting. Thank you for the beads. Now let's bathe them before we shake on it. Or you sit down now on a broad stone, smooth and warm in the sunlight. A butterfly lands nearby, flutters, and moves on. You think about all the negotiations that must have happened here. Not written down, not recorded, but remembered, told, retold, twisted a little with each telling until they became legend. The politics of Great Zimbabwe weren't theatrical. They were intimate, built on proximity, reputation, and slow accumulation of trust or fear. A gift given, a visit refused, a goat returned to sender. Another quirky fact: some royal compounds were built with acoustics in mind. The placement of walls could amplify certain voices and muffle others. So, yes, it's possible someone designed a space where their voice would always carry just a little farther. Strategic stonework, because microphones wouldn't be invented for another 700 years. You rise again, brushing off your hands, and look toward the west. The sun's dipping lower now, painting everything in gold, the soft, non-transactional kind. But you know that back then this light would have meant something else. It meant the day was ending. Time for decisions to be finalized, for guests to be seen off, for judgments to be accepted, sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with gritted teeth. You walk past one last platform, half collapsed but still proud. Maybe it once held an offering bowl. Maybe it was a stage for speeches. Maybe it was just a really nice place to sit and look important. Whatever it was, it mattered. Because here in this golden court without titles carved in stone, every gesture echoed. And somewhere beneath your feet, beneath layers of dirt and broken pottery, lies the dust of a kingdom that ruled without fanfare. Only presence. The sun rests low now, casting long shadows that stretch across the hillside like tired arms reaching for sleep. But your steps carry you upward once again, this time into myth. You've explored homes and huts, granaries and courts, but now you cross into a space where the physical world bent quietly to the spiritual, where rulers weren't just leaders, but rainmakers, dream interpreters, and semi-divine mediators of fate. You're entering the realm of sacred kingship. In the culture of Great Zimbabwe, kings weren't just administrators of tax and livestock, they were bridges between the ancestors and the living, between the land and the sky. And if the rains didn't come, all eyes turned to them, not the clouds. You walk toward a craggy rise, a granite outcrop shaped almost like a throne. It's one of many scattered across the site, often elevated, sometimes surrounded by smaller platforms. It may not look like a temple, but in this world, sacred places didn't always come with spires. Sometimes they were a circle of stones, a shadowed pool, or a smooth slab where rituals were performed by whisper and firelight. Historians still argue whether the rulers of Great Zimbabwe were divine kings in the traditional sense, worshipped as gods, or simply seen as chosen by the ancestors to serve. But one thing is clear, they wielded symbolic power that stretched beyond laws or livestock. The king was responsible for the fertility of the land, the health of the people, the balance of nature itself. If the crops failed, it wasn't bad weather, it was a disturbance in the spiritual order. Maybe someone angered an ancestor. Maybe the king himself needed purification. And yes, there were rituals. You pause beside a cluster of flat stones, their surface worn smooth by centuries of use. These may have been offering platforms. Some oral traditions describe ceremonies in which the king or spirit medium on his behalf offered snuff beer and even cattle to appease the ancestral spirits. Sometimes the offerings were symbolic, sometimes not so much. Here's a quirky tidbit: the king might have lived in semi-seclusion, surrounded by trusted advisors and ritual specialists. He didn't rule with brute force, but with presence, with mystery, with just enough distance to keep him sacred and just enough closeness to keep him feared. And then there were the rainmakers. Not always the king himself, though, sometimes, but often a specific class of spiritual leaders who could call on the ancestors to bring rain. This was no casual job. Being a rainmaker meant retreating into the hills for fasting, prayer, herbal concoctions, and dance, sometimes for days, sometimes longer. Sometimes, if the rain came, you were hailed, fed, and praised. If it didn't, well, you'd best keep your travel bag packed. You pass a small cave now, just an opening in the granite, its mouth shaded by brush. Some believe caves like this were used by rainmakers or spirit mediums during rituals. A place of transformation, of asking and answering, of trembling hands and sacred silence. Another curious belief: thunderstorms were thought to be conversations among ancestors or arguments depending on how loud the thunder got. So, when a storm rolled in, people paid attention. They listened for omens, for names called in the wind, for echoes of past decisions rising again to the surface. You climb a bit higher, following the winding trail that leads to the highest point of the hill complex. The rocks underfoot are dry and sun-warmed. Lizards skitter between cracks. You imagine a priest walking this same path centuries ago, robes of woven fiber, head shaved or dusted with ash, carrying a bowl of snuff and a staff of carved wood. And when he reached the top, the view would have opened like a scroll. Below the valley unfolds homes like freckles on the earth markets, dotted with movement smoke, curling from huts, the river shimmering in the distance like a snake mid-slither. To rule from here was not to dominate. It was to be watched by everything: the land, the ancestors, the sky. Power here came with pressure. You didn't get to lounge around being fabulous. You had to keep the rains coming, the goats birthing, the markets full, and the ancestors happy. That's a tightrope walk in any era. Another quirky, possibly fringe tidbit. Some oral histories suggest that if a king failed too many times, too many droughts, too many misfortunes, he could be removed. Not by war, not by coup, but by ritual, quietly, permanently. No headlines. Just a changing of the guard whispered by the wind and confirmed in firelight. You reach a flat space, now a ceremonial plateau. The earth here feels heavier, like memory is compacted beneath your souls. Maybe coronations happened here. Maybe funerals. Maybe no one remembers, but the stones do. You close your eyes. The breeze tickles your cheek. You imagine drums, low and slow, a call to gather. People arrive dressed in beads, feathers, fabric dyed in soft earth tones. Elders speak. Gifts are laid out, salt, ivory, millet, beer, foaming at the rim of a gourd. And then the king steps forward. Not with fanfare, not with trumpets, but with presence. He doesn't shout, he nods, he gestures. And the land listens. You open your eyes again. The hill around you is quiet now. No coronations today, no sacrifices. Just a bird swooping low overhead, then gone. But still, something lingers here. Maybe it's gravity. Maybe it's reverence. Maybe it's a sound of rain that once came just when the people thought all was lost. And the one who called it, he stood right here. You descend once again, weaving between boulders the size of small cars, granite pressing gently on either side. The trail grows narrower, the sun now slanting through tall grass and acacia branches, flickering light across the rocks like ceremonial flame. The grandeur of courts and kings begins to fade behind you. Ahead waits something older and in some ways even more powerful, the ancestors. Here on the hill complex, Great Zimbabwe's oldest and most sacred space, the line between the living and the dead was thin as mist. You arrive at a low clearing. There's no grand marker here, no statue, no inscribed memorial. But the stones are deliberate, laid out in careful patterns, outlining shrines and courtyards used in ritual practice. If the great enclosure dazzled with engineering, this hill whispered with spirit. The Shona believe in Vadzimu ancestral spirits who watch over their descendants, offering guidance, protection, and sometimes correction. They are not abstract. They are present. They are hungry. And they must be remembered. Offerings were made regularly, snuff laid in small bowls, millet beer poured into the soil bones arranged with reverent hands. Not elaborate, not ostentatious. Just quiet, persistent gestures of connection. You pause beside a flat stone, its surface smooth-stained. Darker in the center, an offering platform. You imagine someone kneeling here, eyes closed, whispering to a grandmother long gone, asking for help with a harvest, a birth, a marriage, or maybe just saying, "Thank you. I see you." Historians still argue whether the rituals conducted here were limited to elites or shared by the broader community. Some suggest the entire hill functioned as a sacred site, visited only on special occasions. Others believe daily spiritual practice unfolded in the spaces you now walk through. Either way, these stone clusters weren't homes, they were thresholds. And the ancestors weren't silent. Another curious detail. Spirit mediums were common here, respected figures, often women who could channel ancestral voices. When conflict stirred, when drought loomed, when something just felt off, the community turned to these mediums. Their trances weren't performances. They were negotiations with the other side. You crouch near a narrow passageway, stones arranged so tightly you can barely squeeze through. Symbolically, this narrowing was significant. In Shona cosmology, moving from wide space to tight space often represented a passage into the spiritual realm. You don't walk through casually, you walk through consciously, so you do. And on the other side, a small alcove opens. sheltered, still, probably once roofed with thatch or bark. It might have held a sacred relic, maybe a carved wooden staff or a clay bowl never used for food. A place set apart. Even now, the air feels heavier here, like you've walked into a story still being told. You sit on a rock in the corner and listen. Birds chirp. A breeze rustles the dry leaves. Somewhere far off, a goat bleats half-heartedly as if not entirely committed to the idea. But beneath these sounds, something quieter pulses. Not voices, not quite. Just presence. And here's a fringe theory. Some archaeologists believe the hill complex acted as a kind of open-air temple, not in the way we think of temples, but as a layered living space of memory. Certain stones may have been placed to align with solstices. Certain paths followed cosmological layouts, not a shrine but a map. A spiritual city built with breathstone and intention. Another quirky observation: the layout of some sacred enclosures mirrors the human body, head, torso, limbs, possibly reflecting a belief in the land as a living being. In this sense, the ancestor rituals weren't just about individuals who'd passed on. They were about the earth itself and your place in it. You walk slowly now, retracing the winding paths. You notice faint carvings in one stone, lines too shallow to be letters, too deliberate to be random. Maybe they're markings for ritual. Maybe they're warnings. Or maybe they're just the idle scratchings of someone waiting for the rain. Because rain too was sacred, and that's what much of this comes down to. The rituals, the offerings, the silence, it all circles back to balance. Between life and death, between people and land, between sky and soil, you pass another platform, this one partially collapsed. Clay fragments lie scattered around, some from pots, others possibly from drums. Rhythm was vital to ritual here. Music helped summon the ancestors, guided the trance, carried the petitions skyward. You can almost hear it now, a soft drumbeat, slow and steady, growing faster as the medium sways her hands, outstretched, her voice no longer her own. The people watched, they waited, and they listened. And you listened too. Another offering bowl appears, tipped over, now half buried. You right it gently, though you know the real offering is memory. Acknowledgement. The whisper of your footstep on this stone. You begin your descent. Downhill, the wind grows softer. The heat eases. You pass the same narrow passage, stepping through it again, this time with the faintest bow. Not out of superstition, out of respect. Because whether or not you believe in ancestral spirits, you've felt their presence here. In the stonework, in the silences, in the places that seem to breathe even when you do not. You step into the light again. The sacred spaces fall behind you, quiet and untouched. But something comes with you. Something old. Something watching. Something that remembers when the line between world and spirit was no wider than the crack between two stones. You return now to the valley, leaving behind the whispering shrines and sacred stones, only to find yourself surrounded by rhythm once more, but a different kind of rhythm. This isn't the pulse of prayer. It's the beat of celebration. Because even in a city wrapped in ritual and hierarchy, the people of Great Zimbabwe danced. And not quietly. You arrive at a broad, open space, once a communal clearing used for gatherings. Ceremonies, maybe even a bit of midnight mischief. The ground here is packed hard by centuries of footsteps, and though grass grows through the cracks, now you can feel it, the energy that lingers when enough people once stomped, swayed, and shouted in unison. Great Zimbabwe wasn't all shrines and solemn faces. It was a living city, and living means laughing, singing, flirting, eating too much roasted maize, and inventing excuses to gather at sunset with a few gourds of fermented sorghum beer. You sit on a boulder at the edge of the space and let your mind wander. The sun is low, the air golden, and the shadows long. You imagine the clatter of drums, the high trill of a reed flute, the shuffle of feet on earth. Women in bright wraps clap in rhythm. Men stomp in lines, their ankles wrapped in rattles made of dried pods. Children chase each other, barely aware that a ritual is unfolding just over their shoulders. Historians still argue whether these dances were primarily religious, social, or political. The truth, probably all three. In Great Zimbabwe movement was meaning. A dance could welcome the harvest call on rain, mark a marriage, or simply say we're still here. You picture the drummers now seated on low stools, their hands moving in perfect time, calloused palms echoing messages across the dusk. Some rhythms were so well known that the moment a certain beat started, everyone knew what came next. Ah, this is for the first fruits ceremonier. That's when Tandarai tripped and broke his cousin's pot. Yes, stories lived in songs. Another quirky detail, beer wasn't just a party favor. It was a sacred drink. Brewed from sorghum or millet, slightly sour, slightly thick, and often shared communally. A gourd of beer wasn't just passed, it was offered. Shared between friends, neighbors, even between generations. Some rituals required pouring a small amount onto the earth first for the ancestors. They drank first after all. You take a slow breath. The imagined scent of grilled meat and smoke clings to your thoughts. It wasn't every night, but when people gathered here, they celebrated with their whole bodies. Dancing wasn't performance. It was connection between the people and the land, between past and present, between joy and memory. Spirit mediums, too, played roles here. A dance wasn't just dance if the medium was involved. It could become trance, movement becoming language, voice becoming vessel. The community didn't watch, they participated, a shared heartbeat. And the clothes, you imagine layers of cloth dyed in ochre and indigo beaded necklaces bouncing with every step. Bone earrings clinking cowrie shells sewn into sashes catching light and laughter. If someone had particularly excellent rhythm, you'd hear about it for weeks. If someone fell during a ceremonial twirl, you'd also hear about that. Another fringe theory. Some researchers believe that specific rhythms were reserved for political transitions, used to announce the death of a king or the appointment of a new one. In a society without written proclamations, drum beats could be law. You step off your boulder and stroll through the clearing. There's a circular feel to it, a natural choreography. Maybe invisible lines once marked where elders sat, where musicians played, where performers entered from the shadows. You half expect to see a dancer appear now, arms raised, eyes closed, body moving to a rhythm only they can hear. And perhaps you do. Not physically, but in the wind sway and the twitch of a leaf on its stem, and the way your feet begin to step in time with some long-forgotten pulse in the ground. The people of Great Zimbabwe danced for life milestones, births, coming-of-age, marriages, deaths. Each step in a person's life could be marked with a beat. When a child received their name, the family danced. When a youth passed into adulthood, they danced. When a woman became pregnant, when a man's beard began to gray, when a spirit called out in the night and needed to be answered, they danced. It wasn't escapism, it was anchoring. And even amid ceremony, there was joy, humor, improvisation. Not every dance went according to plan. Someone always got off beat. Someone's ankle bells broke. Someone tripped over a dog, and that's how it stayed in memory. Remember when Mambo Chikosi tried to do the rain step and fell straight into the beer pot? Laughter became legend. You pause at the far end of the space now near a fallen tree and look back at the clearing. Imagine the sound overlapping rhythm songs layered in call and response, the occasional ululation from an elder, and the rhythmic thump of feet marking the heartbeat of a people. These dances didn't end with the rise of walls. They echoed through generations. Even when Great Zimbabwe's power faded, its rhythms traveled. Migrating communities carried them north, southeast. The steps evolved, but the purpose remained remember who you are, and do it in time. You turn away gently, your steps slow, now but steady. The drums have faded, the laughter quieted. But something remains, a warmth in your chest, a pull in your heel, the urge to move just a little more loosely like the stones are watching your tempo. And as you walk away, one final image settles in your mind. A circle of dancers, the stars overhead, and in the middle a single drumbeat. Older than kings, louder than silence. Yours. The sky darkens now into that soft purple only seen in wide open spaces where the horizon seems to exhale into the stars. The music of the valley fades behind you. The warmth of dance and laughter drifts into stillness, and the world leans gently into night. But not sleep, not yet. Because as great Zimbabwe grew in stature, distant eyes began to take notice, and some of them squinted. Hard. You follow the trail eastward out toward the edges of the city's influence. Past where the homes thinned out, where the grazing fields stretched on where caravans once paused to tighten ropes and adjust loads. This was where Great Zimbabwe began to meet the world beyond. In the 15th century, Arab and Swahili traders from the Indian Ocean coast began speaking more often of a powerful kingdom inland, one surrounded by stone walls rich in cattle and gold. Portuguese explorers soon followed, driven by dreams of wealth spice routes in a place they'd only heard of in whispers, the kingdom of Zimbabwe. They never found its king, but they found the stories, and they wrote them down. And as you may have guessed, they got a lot of things hilariously wrong. You sit on a low ridge now, the landscape below lit silver by the rising moon. This is where myth and misunderstanding collided. The Portuguese arriving along the southeast coast of Africa encountered local Swahili traders who had already been working with Great Zimbabwe for generations. When asked about the inland stone city, they spoke of gold trade and power. But the Portuguese couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of a wealthy African city with monumental architecture and international trade networks. So they did what many confused colonizers do. They reached for old stories. Enter the Queen of Sheba. Yep, that Queen of Sheba. Somehow, through a tangle of misread oral histories and wild speculation, European explorers began to believe Great Zimbabwe was either the palace of the Queen of Sheba or perhaps a Phoenician outpost from biblical times. Because, of course, a stone city with elaborate walls and far-reaching trade couldn't possibly have been built by Africans. Obviously, it must have been someone from the Bible. Historians still argue how exactly these myths gained traction. One theory is that Portuguese explorers desperate to impress their sponsors back home embellished their reports. Another is that biblical narratives were simply the lens through which European thinkers viewed the world. If you saw a stone wall and your only reference for African architecture was none, then you probably defaulted to something grand, ancient, and suspiciously Mediterranean. But the reality was far more interesting. Great Zimbabwe wasn't built by Phoenicians or Shaban royalty. It was built by the ancestors of the Shona people patiently, locally, brilliantly. Its stones came from nearby hills. Its techniques developed over generations. Its power grew from land and labor, not myth. Still, the legend stuck. Here's a quirky tidbit by the 19th century European treasure hunters and amateur archaeologists began tearing through the ruins hoping to find proof of foreign builders. Anything that would confirm their suspicions and erase local claims. One German explorer declared that the ruins were much too elaborate for the Negroes, a sentence so aggressively wrong, it might actually make your eyebrows invert. You walk now along a ridge once used as a lookout. Not for defense necessarily, but perhaps to spot approaching caravans. The light of a fire flickers in your imagination, traders from the coast arriving with cloth beads and 1,000 questions. It's said that even the Swahili word Zimbabwe was used along the coast for centuries to describe any stone-built settlement of note. The reputation of Great Zimbabwe had traveled far. People spoke of its enclosures, its gold, its sacred birds. And like any good game of historical telephone, the more it traveled, the more distorted it became. Another quirky detail. The Portuguese collected bits and pieces of African oral history, mixing them into their own records, then writing letters back to Lisbon describing kings with scepters of ivory and courts of golden silence. It's poetic, sure, but about as accurate as describing a 21st century office tower as the fire cube of the data wizard. And yet there's something strangely flattering about it, isn't there? That this place built with no mortar, with no written script, with no need to conquer or sprawl, could shake the worldview of a continent that believed itself the center of civilization. It's the historical equivalent of showing up to a party in a perfectly tailored outfit and saying nothing while everyone else argues about where you bought it. You reach the top of the ridge. The moon is full now, casting silver over the ancient city. Below you see the walls of the great enclosure curved and mysterious. Beyond them, the dark outlines of huts long gone. It all looks smaller from here, but no less powerful. And you think about how easy it is for myths to bury truth. How tempting it is to deny what you don't expect. How often history is written by those who didn't live it, but not here. Here in the quiet of a Zimbabwean night, the truth is louder than the myth. The stones say, "We were here. We built this. We traded with the world. We danced, we ruled, we prayed, we lived." The Queen of Sheba never walked these halls, but thousands of others did. And their stories still hum beneath your feet. You descend the ridge under the moon's silver eye, the wind soft now like an exhale after a long song. The legends of queens and lost empires fall behind you. And what remains is quieter and perhaps more powerful, the true story of how great Zimbabwe came to an end, and why that ending was not written in conquest. There were no burning armies, no sieges, no mass graves, no last desperate defense of a palace wall. The city didn't fall, it faded. You walk through low brush and scattered stones. Where homes once stood now, only outlines on the land. The quiet here is thick, not with sorrow, but with mystery. Because while we know Great Zimbabwe was once the largest and most influential city in southern Africa, we don't fully know why its people left. Historians still argue whether it was climate politics, resource strain, or some slow blend of them all. But there are clues. You reach a shallow depression where a stream once ran. The soil is dry, cracked. One theory suggests that environmental degradation may have played a role: too many people, too many cattle, too many fires to clear land. The earth became exhausted. The forest thinned. Water sources may have dried or shifted. Grazing lands eroded. And when the land can no longer support the people move. You step over a tangle of roots and into a small clearing, once a courtyard, now a patch of wildflowers. It feels oddly peaceful, not abandoned, just released. Like the city let go of its weight and allowed itself to return to the dust. Another theory: overpopulation. At its peak, Great Zimbabwe may have housed between 10,000 and 18,000 people. That's a lot of mouths to feed a lot of goats to herd a lot of millet to grow. And over time, the balance between resource and population may have cracked. Slowly, invisibly, until one day someone said, "It's time," and they packed their pots, gathered their cattle, and left. Another quirky detail: archaeological evidence suggests that the departure was gradual, not a flight, but a drift. Some areas of the city were vacated before others. Huts fell silent. Markets thinned. Fires stopped burning in certain hearths. And then eventually, even the king stepped down from the hill and walked into the horizon. But here's what's remarkable: the culture didn't die. The people of Great Zimbabwe didn't vanish. They moved north, south, east, forming new communities, building new cities like Kaminalatale and Manyikeni. These successor states carried forward the architectural traditions, the spiritual beliefs, the political systems, and the trade networks. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe didn't crumble with its walls, it rippled outward. You stand in the doorway of what was once a home. The doorway is gone, of course, but the stones remain two vertical slabs side by side like parentheses, left after the sentence has faded. Someone stood here once calling their children in for dinner. Someone leaned here listening for rain. Someone closed this space with a reed mat and slept deeply behind it. Now the doorway frames only moonlight and dust. Here's a fringe theory you may not expect some believe. The fall of Great Zimbabwe wasn't just environmental or economic, it was ideological. That perhaps new religious or social movements challenged the old order. That power, once tied so closely to kings and ancestors, began to shift. That people looked for new ways to live, to believe, to be. Whether true or not, it's compelling. Because no civilization is just bricks and gold, it's ideas. And when ideas change, cities change. You walk now through a garden overtaken by shrubs. Wild figs twist their roots into old stonework. Grass creeps into a former courtyard. Time isn't erasing the city, it's folding it back into itself. Another quiet fact: centuries after the people left, local communities still visited the ruins. Not as tourists, as pilgrims. Rituals continued. Offerings were made. Spirit mediums came to speak with ancestors in the silence of the empty walls. Even when the world forgot Great Zimbabwe, its people remembered. And then came the colonial period. You sigh, yes again. The ruins were discovered by European explorers who, as we've said, couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. But worse than their disbelief was their interference. Excavations in the 19th and early 20th centuries damaged much of what remained. Walls were dismantled, artifacts stolen, false histories imposed. Some researchers even removed soil layers entirely, meaning we may never recover parts of the story that once lay just beneath the surface. And yet the stones are still here. They don't boast, they don't blame, they endure. You find a flat space now open to the sky. You lie down and look up. The stars wheel above you. The air is cool, dry, filled with the faint scent of night-blooming plants and the echo of long-lost fires. This city did not end in flames, it ended in footsteps. And somehow that makes it feel even more alive. There's something peaceful in knowing that not all endings are disasters. Some are just pauses, movements, choices. And now, centuries later, those stones still hold their shape. And wait. You wake slowly to the gentle tug of wind across your face. The sky is soft with pre-dawn gray. Around you, the ruins are quiet, unmoving, but not unfeeling. This place has survived abandonment, misinterpretation, looting, and the occasional deeply unqualified archaeologist with more ego than expertise. And still it stands. But what happens when the world forgets a city and then centuries later tries to remember it again? This is the silence that followed. You walk through grass slick with dew heading toward the lower terraces where the ruins first caught colonial eyes in the 19th century. You know what they saw: walls without mortar towers, without meaning, architecture too elegant to be believed. And because they couldn't imagine Africans building it, they reached for everyone else. You pass a trench narrow, deep, and sad. Not natural. This was a test cut made by early European excavators. Not for preservation, for proof. looking for coins, scripts, bones with inscriptions. Anything that could confirm their deeply held assumption that Africans couldn't have done this. Spoiler, they didn't find what they were looking for, but they took things anyway. Artifacts were shipped to museums across Europe and South Africa. Soapstone birds, ceremonial bowls, trade beads, pottery iron tools, torn from context, removed from shrines, boxed and labeled in languages the builders never spoke. One quirky detail: a British archaeologist named James Theodore Bent, funded by none other than Cecil Rhodes, claimed Great Zimbabwe was built by a northern race coming from Arabia. His entire expedition lasted only a few months, involved very little actual excavation, and resulted in a lot of broken things. Historians still argue how much of Bent's writing was honest confusion and how much was willful denial. But his conclusion shaped decades of colonial education and robbed countless children in southern Africa of the pride that comes from knowing their ancestors built greatness. You pause beside a reconstructed wall partially rebuilt after years of decay and neglect. The stones don't quite sit right. You can feel the difference. They've been touched too much, rearranged like a puzzle whose solution was guessed at and glued down. And yet, despite the damage, despite the lies, despite the books and brochures that clung stubbornly to foreign myths, well into the 20th century, the truth refused to stay buried. In the 1920s and 30s, African scholars, local elders, and skeptical historians began pushing back. They compared oral traditions, studied construction methods, and most importantly, listened. Voices rose. Truth followed. By the time Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, the story had shifted. The ruins were no longer curiosities, they were symbols, foundations, proof. You climb again, this time toward a viewing platform built for visitors. There's a metal plaque, weathered and slightly crooked. It tells a brief revised history. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people between the 11th and 15th centuries. A single sentence, but a defiant one. Another quirky fact: in 1981, a year after independence, the nation changed its name from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. It was more than political, it was spiritual. To name yourself after stone is to make yourself unmoving, unbroken. You walk past a group of school children in your mind on a field trip, uniforms, tidy notebooks out. Their teacher gestures toward the tower, explains the soapstone birds, draws lines in the dirt to show old floor plans. The students ask questions. They laugh. One points to a lizard and shouts, "It's the ancestor!" You smile. That's how a story stays alive. In the years since independence, the site has been protected, studied, celebrated, but also contested. The question of who gets to tell this story, who owns the ruins, who speaks for the ancestors, is still delicate. Local communities, archaeologists, historians, and spiritual leaders don't always agree. Should the ruins be a tourist site, a sacred space, a place of learning, of mourning? There are no easy answers, but at least the people asking the questions now are speaking the right language. You sit on a bench near the entrance to the hill complex. Tourists will arrive here soon. Sun hats, cameras, backpacks full of trail mix, and half-read guidebooks. Some will gaze in awe. Others will glance, snap a photo, and wander off, perhaps not knowing what they're walking through. But someone always stops. Someone always listens. Another fringe theory: some believe the site itself holds memory. That stones touched by so many hands retain an energy, a kind of ancestral echo. If that's true, then this whole city is a library, one without shelves or pages. Just wind and shadow and the sound of your footsteps. The sun begins to rise. Light spills down the stone walls, turning gray to gold. You trace your hand along one gently. The rock is cool but warming. You wonder how many hands have done the same. And then you step back, you leave the stones as you found them, quiet, whole, watching. Because in the silence that followed Great Zimbabwe's decline came forgetting. But now in the silence after rediscovery comes listening. You descend once more into the valley, and this time your footsteps feel heavier, not from fatigue, but from everything you've now carried with you. Whispers of ancestors, the hush of shrines, the beat of drums that once guided entire nights. And in this soft morning light, you notice something else waiting quietly at the edge of memory recovery and reclamation. Because after centuries of misinterpretation, appropriation, and literal trench digging through Great Zimbabwe's legacy, people began to ask a deeper question. What happens to a sacred site when it's been taken apart piece by piece? And can it be made whole again? You find yourself drawn toward a low stone wall that seems older than the rest, not in age, but in wear. The edges are uneven, the shape slightly off. This, you realize, is a section that was rebuilt, reassembled. After being dismantled by colonial explorers who saw a monument but didn't see its meaning. And it isn't the only piece. In the 20th century, as scholars and locals alike began reevaluating the site, debates flared around the removal and possible return of Great Zimbabwe's treasures, especially the soapstone birds. 8 of them were found. For a long time, most were gone. One quirky detail. During colonial rule, at least 5 of the birds were removed and kept in government buildings or private collections. One famously adorned the mantel of Cecil Rhodes' house, because naturally the best way to show respect for an ancient African civilization is to stick its most sacred object next to your fireplace. It took decades of protest diplomacy and cultural pressure, but most of the birds have been returned. They now rest in the Great Zimbabwe Museum nearby, housed safely but still apart from the stones that once cradled them. And yet one remains missing, hidden, lost, or perhaps simply waiting. You sit on a fallen stone beneath a baobab tree, its thick trunk like an old man's shoulder. You imagine the people who fought for those birds, activists, elders, archivists, people who stood in front of museum doors and said, "This does not belong here." Their voices carried more than protest. They carried memory. Historians still argue whether sacred artifacts should remain in museums for safety or be returned to their original contexts, even if those contexts are now fragmentary. What do you do with a shrine when the ritual is no longer practiced? When the person who carved the object has been dead for 700 years, there are no simple answers. But the movement matters. Another curious detail, the return of the soapstone birds became a national event. Not just a scholarly footnote, but a moment of healing. The birds were welcomed like ancestors returning home. Ceremonies were held. Songs were sung. Children were told, "They're back." You walk now through the grounds of the modern-day museum, a modest building near the ruins. It houses artifacts recovered from the site, iron tools, pottery fragments, glass beads, carved figurines. Some are behind glass. Others are part of educational exhibits. There's no grand fanfare, no elaborate lighting, just the soft presence of what once was. And in one corner, a replica of a soapstone bird. The plaque beside it reads simply, "Symbol of the nation," because it is. The bird is on Zimbabwe's flag. Its silhouette watches over government buildings. It's been sketched into school books, inked onto skin, embroidered into cloth. And yet its origin, this city, this hill, this valley, was once deliberately hidden. Now it is central. You leave the museum and return to the ruins. They feel different now. Not just historical, but political. Not frozen in time, but part of something ongoing. The people who live nearby, the descendants of those who built these walls, still hold ceremonies here. Still tell stories. still speak of Great Zimbabwe not as a ruin, but as a place that breathes. Another fringe theory: some say the ancestors never left, that the spirits still walk the corridors muttering in the stone language keeping watch, and that anyone who listens long enough might hear them. You don't have to believe it, but you can feel it. You pass a signpost for visitors, weathered, humble. It reads, "Please respect the site. Walk gently. This is not just history, it is home." And you do, because you've seen what happens when home is taken apart. When meaning is replaced with myth, when the world forgets to ask the people who live there what the stones were for. You stand at the edge of the great enclosure once more. The conical tower rises ahead of you, still quiet, still unclaimed. It never asks to be interpreted, it just is. And that's the real story. Great Zimbabwe doesn't need you to explain it. It needs you to witness it, not as a ruin or a mystery or a museum piece, but as a testament to endurance, to return, to the long patient breath of a place that will not be erased. You step back again, and the stones do not move, but they remember. The path is gentler now, sloping downhill through scattered brush and low rock walls softened by moss. You walk with a different rhythm, slower, more deliberate, as if the earth is encouraging reflection rather than discovery. After the noise of empire and the silence of collapse after theft and return, you enter a space where memory becomes national story. Because Great Zimbabwe did not remain in the past. It became the foundation of something new. As the 20th century drew to a close, a movement was building, not just for independence, but for identity. Across Africa, newly independent nations looked to their histories, searching for symbols of unity, pride, and place. And for Zimbabwe, the answer was carved in stone. In 1980, when the country cast off its colonial name, Rhodesia named for the man who once hoarded its sacred birds, the new leaders looked inland, not to Harare, not to the coast, but here, to the ancient city with no king's name. On record, no epic conquest to boast of, but a greatness rooted in stone and silence. And so the name Zimbabwe was chosen. You stop near a signboard where grass brushes your ankles. It displays the country's flag's 7 horizontal stripes of green, gold, red, and black, and on the left a white triangle with a red star, and at its center, a yellow soapstone bird, a symbol pulled from the ruins, lifted from the dust, and made national. Another quirky detail: the bird on the flag isn't an exact replica of any single artifact. It's a stylized blend wing, slightly outstretched, gaze fixed forward. It's part Shona tradition, part artistic liberty, and part political statement. We built this. We still do. You wander back toward the great enclosure and pass a group of students on a field trip, imaginary now, but real in essence. A teacher points at the walls, explains their construction. The children draw little rectangles in their notebooks. One whispers, "I'd live in a stone house like that." There's pride here, but also complexity. Because national symbols aren't simple. They're chosen, shaped, debated, and sometimes they bear more weight than any stone wall. Historians still argue whether the use of Great Zimbabwe as a national symbol oversimplifies its history. That, to turn a sacred site into political iconography, risks losing its spiritual nuance, its regional roots, its messy, beautiful contradictions. Is it possible to honor both the myth and the material? You reach a lookout point, now a low, circular stone bench installed for reflection. It overlooks the valley where the city once pulsed with life. And in the hazy distance, you can almost make out the silhouette of modern Zimbabwe roads stretching like veins towns, flickering with electric light cities rising from hills not unlike these. The stones may have settled, but the legacy never did. Another curious footnote: Great Zimbabwe was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986. not just for its age or its size or its mystery, but because it stands as a rare, monumental example of African urbanism. No temples looted from abroad, no imported blueprints, just an indigenous vision of community beauty and power. But here's the part that still catches in the throat. Even now, Great Zimbabwe isn't fully excavated. Much of it remains unexplored, undisturbed, on purpose. Why? Because some stories aren't meant to be completely uncovered. They're meant to be lived with, listened to, respected. You walk again past a stone pathway with weed-choked edges, past the remains of a hut platform now used by birds and spiders, past a pile of sun-warmed rocks that may have once been a granary and is now just resting. Each part of this city carries a different story. Not loud ones, but long ones. And the people of Zimbabwe have taken those stories and woven them into new forms: poetry, music, architecture. Artists have carved birds anew. Writers have imagined voices for the silent walls. Politicians have given speeches from atop platforms modeled after the hill complex. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't. But that's the nature of living history it breathes. Another fringe theory: some say Great Zimbabwe is not done. That it's not just a place of the past but a blueprint for future cities, ones built on human scale, with sacred space at the center, with dignity in the stone and ceremony in the everyday. You can almost see it, a modern city inspired by old curves. No glass towers, no concrete boxes, just homes that whisper, markets that echo, a city that remembers as it grows. You reach the edge of the ruins again. The boundary between sight and countryside, between history and everything else. A single carved post marks the end of the protected zone. You turn around and look one last time. The towers, the walls, the stone still standing. And something flickers in your chest, not nostalgia, but continuity. A sense that you've joined a story, not just read one. You step beyond the marker into the living world. And behind you, the city does not vanish. It waits. You follow a dirt path that winds around the edge of the ruins, past thorn trees and fallen granite, until even the stones begin to disappear behind tall grass and silence. But the story doesn't stop here. It branches outward through time and across landscapes carried not by stone walls but by footsteps. Because after Great Zimbabwe, other cities rose. And while none would match its grandeur in quite the same way, they didn't have to. They were part of the same breath. You arrive at a wide plateau now, wind tugging at your sleeves. This place, dry open, dotted with distant copies, could be almost anywhere in southern Africa. And that's the point. Great Zimbabwe was not alone. It was part of a network, a tradition, a rhythm of building, trading, believing, and when the time came, moving on. But let's visit a few of its siblings, shall we? First to the southwest, Kami. Built shortly after Great Zimbabwe's decline, Kami rose near modern-day Bulawayo. Its builders used the same dry stone technique, but added a twist literally. The walls of Kami are decorated with intricate patterns, chevrons, herringbones, checkered friezes. They weren't just practical, they were art. Historians still argue whether Kami was a direct successor state or a regional cousin. But one thing is clear: the people who built it were not starting from scratch. They carried the knowledge of Great Zimbabwe forward, adapting it to new terrain, new climates, new needs. You picture the scene: walls rising in graceful curves, platforms layered like wedding cakes, ceremonial spaces shaded by mopon trees. The echoes of the past not copied but translated. Another quirky detail: Kami's location near a river meant that it required more careful drainage planning than Great Zimbabwe. The architects developed innovative terracing systems, practical and elegant. Even in ruin, Kami shows a flair for design. It doesn't shout power, it whispers sophistication. Then to the north, Mutapa. This wasn't a city, but an empire. The Mutapa state also called the Kingdom of Monomotapa, which expanded across parts of modern-day Zimbabwe and Mozambique. It inherited much of Great Zimbabwe's trade networks, especially gold. The rulers of Mutapa dealt directly with Portuguese merchants, even issuing their own gold weights and setting trade terms. And while they didn't build cities as monumental as Great Zimbabwe, their influence stretched farther. From hilltop fortresses to riverside markets, the Mutapa kings made their mark in diplomacy, warfare, and economy. You reach another open rise now. The wind picks up rustling through thorn scrub. It carries the scent of dry earth and distant wood smoke. You can almost hear voices, dealings, negotiations, arguments. The language has changed. The cadence remains. Next stop, Naletal and Dolodlo. These were smaller, more decorative sites, but their wall patterns rival anything in the region. Nalatal in particular boasts stonework so precise it looks like fabric turned to granite rows of triangles, zigzags and checkerboards wrapping around platforms like a ceremonial sash. Another fringe theory. Some researchers believe that these decorative flourishes weren't just aesthetic, they encoded information. Clan symbols, cosmological beliefs, perhaps even oral history in visual form. If so, they were walls you didn't just walk by, you read them. Or more accurately, you remembered them. You walk now through low stone ruins, not of Great Zimbabwe, but a cousin city lost to most maps. The stones are shorter, the layout simpler, but the feeling is familiar. A ringed enclosure, a platform, a path shaped like a question mark. It's like catching a tune you haven't heard in years, but somehow still know all the words to. Because this is what's most astonishing, the style, technique, and spirit of Great Zimbabwe didn't vanish when the capital faded. They flowed outward, inward, through families, through tools, through memory. One child learns to stack stone from his grandfather. A granddaughter learns how to mix soil for polished floors. A traveling merchant tells tales of a city with towers. And in a new place among new hills, someone says, "Let's build again." You pass a shaded grove. A circle of stones lies half buried in the grass. Another granary, a shrine, a dance ground. You don't know, but you feel the shape of intention, and you realize something simple and beautiful. Greatness doesn't have to be centralized. It can ripple. It can echo. It can adapt. Another quirky footnote. In the 17th century, Portuguese chroniclers described dozens of inland settlements with stonework, similar to Great Zimbabwe. Some are lost now, overgrown, unexcavated, waiting beneath thorns and termite hills. But they existed, and they spoke the same architectural language even if dialects varied. You walk slowly now, your feet tracing a path that millions once walked, mothers, with children, elders with staffs, herders whistling at reluctant goats. The city behind you is grand. The cities ahead are humble. But they are connected. In stone, in silence, in style. It makes you think maybe empire isn't about conquering or centralizing. Maybe it's about continuity. The ability to hold a vision and carry it forward, adapt it, share it. Leave a trail of stones behind, not to mark ownership, but to mark passage. You reach the edge of the hill and look out over the savannah. Somewhere out there is Kami. Somewhere Nalatal. Somewhere a yet unfound city resting beneath a tangle of roots and stories. And in your mind they are not ruins. They are chapters of the same book, still being written. The wind carries you forward now, sweeping over the sun-baked hills like an old song that never quite ends. You're no longer inside Great Zimbabwe, but you're still very much within its gravity. Because long after the stones were quiet, their shape remained in other forms. Forms you can still touch today. In the towns, the houses, the politics, the language, the echoes of Great Zimbabwe have not faded. They've simply changed shape. You follow a dirt road into the edges of a modern village. It's not marked on most maps. There's a row of small houses, some of brick, some of clay and wood. Satellite dishes peek out from rooftops. A child runs by with a plastic bottle tied to string, dragging it like a chariot. Chickens patrol the front yards like they own the place. They probably do. This isn't a museum. This is life. And still, you see it. The round hut with the thatched roof, its entrance facing east, just like in the old days. The courtyard with 3 houses arranged in a circle. The raised granary. The cooking fire in the center. These are not nostalgic gestures. They are architecture alive with ancestry. One quirky detail: many Zimbabwean homes still follow layout principles from the Iron Age separation of private and public space, symbolic placement of doors and walls, the integration of sacred altars tucked into everyday life. The modern house here is a descendant of Great Zimbabwe's hut. Even in the city's Harare Bulawayo, you'll find traces. The architecture is different, sure, but the patterns remain. A respect for round forms, a love of stone textures, a sense of spatial flow that echoes the enclosures once raised on the hill. You sit near a village well now, its circular stone lips smoothed by generations of hands. A woman draws water in a tin bucket, glances at you, and smiles with the soft confidence of someone who knows this land and its stories intimately. The names too carry legacy. Zimbabwe isn't just the name of a country, it's the identity of a people. The word invokes stone history presence. It's used in songs and poetry and protest chants. Politicians invoke it. Poets sculpt with it. School children recite it before exams. It's not always used gently, but it's always used with weight. Another curious fact: during times of political struggle, citizens often return to Great Zimbabwe physically or symbolically as a reminder of what endures. When trust in leadership falters, when the future grows murky, people look back to the stone, not for answers, but for grounding. Historians still argue whether modern Zimbabwe fully honors the complexity of its namesake. Some feel the site has become too politicized, used to prop up authority, simplified into slogans. Others believe that's what symbols are for, to be lived with, argued over, adapted. You walk toward a school now, just beyond the village. It's recess. Children are playing. Their voices fill the air, rising above the scrub and distant hills. You hear them call out the name Zimbabwe in a game song. You don't know the rules, but the sound is clear. They know where they are. Inside the classroom, the teacher points to a chalkboard drawing of Great Zimbabwe's walls. There's the conical tower, the hill complex, the soapstone bird. The students nod, answer questions, recite dates, but their faces light up when asked who built this. And the answer comes without hesitation. We did. That's the difference. That's the shift. Not in stones, but in ownership. You step back outside. The sun is high now. A goat watches you from behind a tree. You nod politely. It doesn't return the gesture. You keep walking, passing roadside stalls, woven baskets carved, walking sticks, roasted maize. A man sells miniature stone birds carved from local rock. They're not replicas, they're interpretations. Some have wide wings, some have spiral eyes. All of them different, all of them valid. Art, like history, moves forward. Another fringe observation. Some scholars now study Great Zimbabwe not just as a ruin, but as a lens for African futures, urban planning, sustainability, cultural continuity. The layout of the ancient city is being referenced in new eco-communities and tourism infrastructure, even in graphic design. The past, it turns out, is quite good at consulting. You pass a small roadside chapel, walls made of mud brick roof, thatched inside, filled with candle stubs and paper prayers. It doesn't mention ancestors explicitly, but the placement of the altar, the curve of the room, the orientation of the door, those are older than doctrine. They're Zimbabwean. You sit one final time beneath a tree that doesn't know whether it's growing or sleeping. You look back toward where the ruins rest and ahead to where the country moves. And in the space between past and present, you hear it again. Stone, voice, footstep, bird. Not as memory, as rhythm, as pulse, as home. The sun dips low once again, casting its last warm light across the hills where stone walls bend and shadows stretch. You've come full circle back to the city that started as a handful of huts, grew into a marvel of stone and spirit, then drifted into silence without ever truly vanishing. Now you stand alone in the fading light inside the heart of great Zimbabwe. Not as an outsider, not as a visitor, but as someone who's listened. The great enclosure curves around you one last time, its granite walls bathed in soft amber, its conical tower calm and unbothered by all the centuries of speculation. You notice the stillness again, not empty but full, like the pause at the end of a long breath. Because this is what Great Zimbabwe has always been, a breath held across time. You step slowly through the narrow corridor that threads through the wall, your shoulders brushing stone, your shadow stretching ahead. You emerge into the open courtyard where ancestors once gathered children, once played where soapstone birds once watched silently from their perches. And here you pause. This city has taught you much not in lectures or texts, but in murmurs. Through granite, through layout, through absences. It's a city without a single written word, and yet it speaks fluently. It has told you that power can be shaped like a curve, that greatness doesn't need to shout, that architecture can whisper belief, that departure isn't always defeat, and that a people can be scattered without being erased. You look once more at the stones. You want them to say something final, but they don't. They just wait. They've been waiting longer than most nations have existed, because they know the people who built them never really left. Their names may not be carved into plaques. Their faces may not appear in textbooks, but their fingerprints are pressed into every pattern, every pathway, every sacred silence. And now you are part of the remembering. As the dusk folds gently over the hills, you walk away slowly. You don't look back. You don't need to. Great Zimbabwe isn't behind you. It's beneath you. It's in the language you now understand, in the rhythm your footsteps have begun to match, in the knowledge that this city, this house of stone, isn't gone. It's simply resting. And now, as the stars emerge one by one above the hills of southern Africa, you let your breathing slow. You've walked through ancient gates, stepped over forgotten thresholds, traced stories shaped in stone. You've listened to silent kings, watched the dance of ancestors, felt the weight of stolen birds and returned names. And all the while, the land itself has held you steady, quiet, unchanged, even as everything else shifted. There's something comforting in knowing that not all endings come with fire. Some arrive like twilight, soft, slow, graceful. Just like the way Great Zimbabwe faded from view but not from meaning. Just like the way the ancestors are never loud but always near. Let that calm settle in your chest now. No more questions. No more walking. Just the stillness of stone, the hush of wind through tall grass, the glow of moonlight kissing granite. Let the last echoes of the drum fade away in your memory. Let the stories lie quiet beneath your thoughts, resting as you do beneath a sky older than any city. This is where we leave it. The house of stone still standing. The city without a script still speaking. And you no longer a stranger to it. Sleep comes easy now, slow as the rise of mist from a morning river. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.